What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be breaking down all of the main card fights from this weekend's UFC Fight Night Strickland versus Hermansson card. Hopefully you'll be able to use the information in this video to make better betting decisions and maybe even earn some extra cash this weekend. And if you like the breakdowns for the main card fights that I'll be covering in this video, don't forget on my website you can find breakdown videos for all the other fights on this card, all of those prelim matchups. There's a link in the description below and you can see it in the background here, MMABettingTips.com. Check it out. On there you'll also find a wide range of bets for various different things relating to this weekend's UFC card, like prop bets, straight money line bets, things like that. Pretty much every type of bet that you'll find on the website is profitable, and hopefully you enjoyed today's video where we'll be taking a very close look at some very interesting matchups this weekend. This should be very competitive and give us some good opportunities to hopefully make some cash. But remember to gamble responsibly. Remember, nothing in this video is financial advice. I'm not telling you what to do. This is just my opinion, a guy that sits in his pants watching fights all day for a living. I strongly recommend it if you want to bet the fights this weekend yourself. You do your own research, but hopefully you'll find some value in the information that I'm going to share with you today. I also want to let you guys know that I stream most of my fight research throughout the week on Twitch. The sessions last between 1 and 2 hours for every single fight that I'll be talking about in today's video, and that's all free. You can find a link for that in the description below as well. Now I'm going to switch things up a little bit this week as we jump into these breakdown videos, because what I usually do is start with the very first fight on the main card, and then I work my way through each of the matchups up to the co-main and main event. But I found that because these videos are quite long, and because I talk a lot, by the time I get to the main event, I've kind of burnt myself out a little bit and I start to ramble a little bit, which I'm already terrible at doing. So I'm going to flip things on its head from now on, and I'm going to talk about the main event first, because this is obviously the fight that, or the main event is usually the fight that most people care about on a UFC event. So I thought, rather than starting strong and burning myself out in most of my breakdown videos, I'm gonna start a little bit, I'm gonna start strong, do things in the same way, but focus on the fights that most people care about more than any other. And so we're gonna start off with the main event and do things in reverse from now on, because I found on my last breakdown video for that Gan versus Ngannou card, I was dead by the time I got to the end of that video. It was like an hour and 20 minutes of me just talking, whereas the breakdowns earlier in the video were pretty good. I'm rambling again now, so I should just shut the fuck up and focus on breaking down this fight between Sean Strickland and Jack Hermansson, which is a great matchup. If we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Sean Strickland is currently around an average of about 1.47, which is minus 213 for an implied probability of 68%. If we take a look at the odds on Jack Hermansson, he is currently around an average of, call it 2.80, which is going to be plus 180 for an implied probability of 36%. So Strickland quite a big favourite coming into this matchup. What I would also recommend you doing, if you are thinking of betting the fight this weekend, is taking a look at Dan Hardy's breakdown for this fight. Where is it? Strickland, Hermansson. I won't play any of the breakdown because it may result in this video getting copyright flagged. But you can see I've watched it here, and I would strongly recommend you watching this as well. When it comes to breakdowns, I don't really watch anyone except for Dan Hardy, because I find that 99% of the people that kind of share their opinions about fights online and do breakdown videos, they don't do proper fight research, in terms of they don't actually study the fights. They work from hazy memories, or they make decisions based on win-loss records. So I only like to take people's opinions on board that I know have actually, sat down and watched a lot of footage on a fight to try and gauge how two guys match up stylistically. And I know that Dan does this, so I watch all of Dan's breakdowns, and for the most part I agree with him on most fights. But with this one, me and Dan have quite different perspectives on this matchup. So I think it's very important that you watch maybe my breakdown, to give you a perspective of this fight from someone that bets on MMA for a living, and then get Dan's perspective on it from someone that is obviously infinitely more knowledgeable in fighting a martial arts than I am, and has a much deeper understanding of how these guys match up from a stylistic perspective than I ever could. But then perhaps, because I make money betting on MMA for a living, I'm possibly able to calculate, based on past performances, which side here carries the better risk to reward ratio based on the odds. Whereas obviously Dan's not thinking about that. He's a martial artist who is focusing very much on the skill set both these guys bring to the table, as opposed to who would give you the better risk to reward ratio if you were to choose to bet this fight. So I would recommend watching Dan's breakdowns. He's going to say a lot of stuff that I don't think is that relevant, and maybe I'm wrong, right? It could be very relevant. Who the fuck knows? Check it out, though, for two very, very different perspectives on this fight. So, to kick things off, the reason why I think me and Dan are very different in our opinion on this one is because Dan has got the perspective that Hermansson struggled against Marvin Vettori, which he definitely did because he lost the fight. But the main reason why Hermansson lost this fight is because he got knocked down early by Vettori, found himself in a lot of trouble very early in that fight, and then was playing catch up, into the second, third, fourth, and fifth round. I think it's difficult for me to say had that not happened. The fight would have gone better for Hermansson. It may have not have done because Vettori did commit a lot of energy going for the finish early. So it's possible Vettori would have, performed much better in the second, third, fourth, and fifth round as well. But I actually think that Hermansson performed pretty well against Vettori and did a lot better than I expected in terms of how he matched up against Vettori from a striking perspective. And I think that me and Dan are very far apart in our opinions on this fight, because I actually consider Marvin Vettori to be a pretty good MMA boxer and a much better MMA boxer than Strickland. Therefore, coming into this matchup, I'm looking at that Vettori fight and I'm going, do you know what? In the third, fourth, and fifth round, Hermansson did pretty well against Vettori in that kickboxing range. With Vettori being a better striker than Strickland, in my opinion, I could actually see Hermansson giving Strickland a lot of problems in the stand-up in this fight. Whereas I don't think Dan is rating Vettori striking as highly as he rates Strickland, and that's where we very much differ on this one. So just bear that in mind. I could be completely wrong in this one. Dan knows a lot more about the intricacies of striking than I do. But if we break this one down from a stylistic point of view, the easiest thing to tick off the list straight away is the grappling. We know that Hermansson is primarily a grappler. We know that Sean Strickland is primarily a striker. So a big part of assessing what probability Herman has of winning this fight is going to come down to how likely it is that Hermansson is going to be able to get this fight to the ground. And while Sean Strickland's takedown defense isn't bulletproof, what we do know is that he came from the Team Quest kind of stable of fighters, and we know that historically Team Quest fighters tend to be almost impossible to take down and even harder to hold down. If you think of even a guy like Sam Alvey, right? Sam Alvey is a product of that team, old school Team Quest, group of fighters. Even Sam Alvey, with how slow he is and how flat-footed he stands and how stiff and unathletic he is, Alvey is still incredibly difficult to take down and very, very hard to hold down. And Strickland definitely has that in him. We talk about how Nova União is a stable of fighters that always show up with very good takedown offense and they're very difficult to hold down. Team Quest is another one. So while Strickland's takedown offense isn't bulletproof, usually if a guy takes him down and then manages to obtain some control time on the ground, is usually a conscious decision that Strickland is making to kind of not immediately start to work his way back up to his feet and instead accept being in a bad position on the ground. Because when Strickland actively does try to work his way back up to his feet after being taken down, it's almost impossible to stop him from getting back up. He's very, very good at scrambling back up to his feet. So Jack Hermansson does have some pretty good reactive double leg takedowns. You know, the timing on his takedown entries is very good. I've got no doubt that he can get Strickland to the ground, but I don't think he's going to be able to hold Sean Strickland on the ground. And even though Hermansson may get Strickland down, it's not going to be easy because Sean Strickland's takedown offense is very, very good. Does a really good job of, you know, spotting the takedown entry coming early, you know, clearing his legs, getting those underhooks in play very, very early on. And because he's very good at reading that initial takedown entry, the only way you're really going to be able to take Strickland down, unless you catch him completely cold, is if you use chain wrestling and you're persistent with your takedown attempts to kind of overwhelm him with different techniques and hope to capitalize on, you know, a mistake he makes where he momentarily takes his eye off the ball. And then you can kind of drag him to the ground with whatever technique you're using, you know, or chain him from technique to technique. That is how you get a guy like Strickland down, and it's exactly what Kamaru Usman did to him. If you look at the approach of Kamaru Usman and Court McGee, you know, these fights, you know, they only took place sort of 6 or 7 months apart from each other, but the different approaches of grappling from Kamaru Usman compared to Court McGee highlighted the style of grappling you need to use to have any success against Strickland, because the style of takedown that Usman used was to drive Strickland into the cage and then start to chain lots of different, you know, takedown techniques together to ultimately, you know, find an opening in Strickland's takedown offense and ultimately drag him to the ground. Whereas McGee was shooting more, you know, single double leg takedown entries, just shooting singular takedown entries where it was a double leg or a single leg. But once Strickland would deal with that initial takedown entry, there wasn't a whole lot of chain wrestling behind that or too much persistence in trying to get the fight to the ground behind that. And so Strickland coped a lot better in that fight and was able to neutralize McGee's, you know, offensive wrestling a lot better than he did against Usman. It was because the styles that they used. What's interesting about watching those two fights is that Jack Hermansson's style of wrestling is far more aligned to what you'd get from Court McGee than with Kamaru Usman. Hermansson's not really a chain wrestler. He's one of these guys that will shoot in and commit hard to big, explosive, singular takedown attempts. And then if he doesn't get that, he'll kind of retreat and go back to kickboxing range. A large part of this is to do with Hermansson's gas tank. Hermansson is one of these guys that the more he grapples, the more tired he gets. So he has to use his grappling sparingly, which is why you'll see long periods of striking in Hermansson's fights, because he doesn't have the gas tank to grapple hard for 15 minutes, 25 minutes. That's why you'll kind of see Hermansson pick his moments when to grapple, and I think that's actually going to make it even more difficult for him to use his grappling in this fight, because Strickland is going to get a read on Hermansson, and if Hermansson's not coming out the gate with a grappling heavy game plan straight away, Strickland is going to have more time to settle into a rhythm, get a read on Hermansson, and then start to see those takedown entries coming from a mile away. We've seen guys like Jared Cannonier turn Jack Hermansson into a panic wrestler in the past, and I could see Sean Strickland doing exactly the same thing. So this is kind of another area where me and Dan perhaps differ on this one. Dan has identified some things Hermansson can do on the ground to potentially cause Strickland a problem. I don't think Hermansson's going to be able to keep Strickland on the ground long enough for him to get anything going. So in terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view when it comes to striking, this one is a very interesting one, because I do think that Strickland is one of these guys that is very, very good at being the hammer, but not so good at being the nail. We know that Strickland, since coming back from having that horrendous motorcycle accident, is one of these guys that is, fearless, reckless at times, He's chaotic, he's got the heart of a lion, that warrior spirit, and he likes to come forward, push a pace, force his opponent onto the back foot, where he can kind of break them down and wear them down with his pressure. The problem with Strickland, and what we really saw in his last fight against Uriah Hall, was that he's nowhere near as effective if he's not allowed to lead the dance. If you go back and watch that Uriah Hall fight, he caused Uriah Hall a lot of problems when he was, coming forward, staying behind the jab, chipping away at Uriah Hall. But as soon as Uriah Hall stood his ground, refused to be backed up and started to fire back, Strickland actually looked quite bad defensively and didn't really get anything going offensively either. By putting Strickland under the back foot, Uriah Hall was able to completely take Strickland's volume away, which makes him a lot easier to deal with. The best example I can think of, which would be probably very familiar to you as to how to cause a guy like Sean Strickland a problem, is to kind of compare him to Nate Diaz, right? When we think about Nate Diaz when he's at his best when he's coming forward, applying a lot of pressure on his opponents, forcing them to fight in an uncomfortable range on the outside, and he's overwhelming them with pressure and volume. But then if we think about the times that Nate Diaz has struggled, it's when guys have not been or not allowed Diaz to dictate the pace, right? They've taken control of the center of the octagon. They've put Diaz on the outside. You think about, the two Conor fights, early in the first Conor fight, early in the second Conor fight, how much damage Conor was able to inflict on Nate when Conor took control of the center of the octagon and forced Nate to fight on the outside. Think of the Masvidal fight where the same thing happened, and most recently the Leon Edwards fight, right, where Diaz just couldn't get any respect in there. Edwards just walked Diaz down and completely, blew him out the water. My fear with Strickland is that you could see the same thing happen, where when we look at the guys that he's faced, since coming back from this motorcycle accident, you can see this long break, this 2-year break here. So these are the fights that he's had. These are the 4 fights he's had since coming back from the motorcycle accident. And the motorcycle accident is a very pivotal point in Strickland's career, because before the motorcycle accident, he was very passive, very tentative, a very low volume striker, a guy that really struggled to put his stamp on rounds. And now since the motorcycle accident, he's a lot more aggressive. He's coming back as a pressure fighter. But when you look at the guys that he's faced, Uriah Hall has always been a relatively low volume counter striker. Krzysztof Jotko, a guy that doesn't really have too much power in his hands. He's going to struggle to get respect in there from a guy like Strickland. Brendan Allen's very poor defensively, and Jack Marshman is a pretty decent boxer, but he's also very one-dimensional. So when you look at the guys that Strickland's been facing, it's quite notable to me that it wouldn't have been super difficult for Strickland to take control of the center of the octagon in those matchups and dictate the pace of those fights. And he kind of struggled at times to do that against Uriah Hall. If you go back and watch the Uriah Hall fight, it was a very dominant performance from Strickland, but at the same time, it was unconvincing at times. I strongly recommend you go back and watch that. And so now we go from him facing, a one-dimensional guy like Marshman, a couple guys that are quite passive counter strikers, and Brendan Allen, who's bad defensively, to now jump into a guy like Jack Hermansson, who, we have seen, compete against the top guys in the division, right? Go 5 hard rounds against Marvin Vettori, get a finish against Calvin Gasson very quickly, outwork Jacare over 5 rounds, which is never an easy thing to do. And it's potentially quite a big step up for Strickland, which feels like a crazy thing to say because he's been in the UFC forever and he's had almost 30 pro fights now. But there were flashes of a fighter in the Uriah Hall fight that I think could really struggle when he goes up against someone like Jack Hermansson that moves pretty well, has got the gas tank to strike a decent pace for 5 rounds. Based on the Marvin Vettori fight, a guy that won't be bullied by Strickland, and there's signs in that Uriah Hall fight that Strickland could kind of struggle here, which I didn't expect to be saying. When I first started scanning through all the matchups on this card and looking at the odds, I just assumed I would be betting Sean Strickland. He's looked great recently. He's on that upwards career trajectory. He's that exciting, shiny new thing in the middleweight division, which again is a crazy thing to say because he's been around forever. But you guys get what I mean, right? He's very hyped up and he's fought his way now into that title picture, that title discussion. I thought I would be betting Sean Strickland this weekend, but watching that Uriah Hall fight, I do have doubts. I do have doubts over him. And, this comes back to how, someone like myself that makes money betting on MMA for a living, and someone like Dan who, now makes a living from being the best MMA analyst in the world, in my opinion, our approach to this would be very different. Because from my perspective, I'm looking at both these guys and I'm trying to work out who gives me the better risk to reward ratio. If I bet $100 on Sean Strickland, I can only win $44, if he wins. If I bet $100 on Jack Hermansson, while there is no doubt that this is a very difficult fight for Jack Hermansson, if I bet $100 on Hermansson, I win $175 back. That's substantially more than if I bet on Strickland and he were to win. And for that reason, I do think that this is a dog or pass matchup, which I didn't expect to be saying. I honestly thought before researching this one that I would lean Strickland heavily, but I don't. I think this could be a pretty competitive fight. And as a result, even if I do think Strickland is slightly more likely to win, I just feel Hermansson gives you the much better risk to reward ratio. This is a really complicated fight because I think that your perspective on this fight will be determined by how highly you rate Marvin Vettori's boxing and how impressed you are by how Hermansson was able to hold his own in kickboxing range against Hermansson into that 3rd, 4th and 5th round. If you think that Strickland is a better boxer than Vettori, then, I can understand why you'd favour Strickland here. But if you think Vettori's a better boxer than Strickland, there could be trouble ahead for Strickland in this fight because he doesn't really have that much power in his hands. He doesn't throw a very diverse range of attacks, doesn't throw many kicks. He kind of just pumps the jab out there. He's a little bit stiff, a little bit rigid, doesn't move his head that much. He's not the best defensively. And so I do think this one could get dicey for Strickland. I do think he's more likely to win. But if you really want to bet this fight this weekend, of course, do your own research. But I do think Hermansson gives you the better risk to reward ratio. I do think this is a dog or pass matchup. And I'm quite surprised that I'm saying that because I thought I'd love Strickland in this fight. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the fight between Punahele Soriano and Nick Maximov. Very interesting matchup this. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Punahele Soriano is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.53, which is minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. And if we take a look at the odds on Nick Maximov, he's currently around an average of 2.60, which is plus 160 for an implied probability of 38%. So whenever we talk about a Punahele Soriano fight, I feel that the main thing that we're always going to be focusing on is his gas tank, because this guy's gas tank is a real big issue to the point where, 3-4 minutes into his fights, he tends to gas himself out bad. And even though he's a tough guy that will continue to push through it and continue to fight even when he gets very tired, the big issue with Punahele Soriano is that when he gasses out after that third or fourth minute mark, his output absolutely falls off a cliff. He was very, very fortunate in the Dusko Todorovic fight to get a finish late in round 1 because he was gassing very bad in that fight, but some fouls in that matchup gave Soriano a couple of opportunities in that first round to, catch his breath a little bit at points where he was starting to look very tired. But in the 2 times in his pro career where we've seen him go the distance against Jamie Pickett and Brendan Allen, he has gassed extremely bad after just 3 or 4 minutes. And it kind of happened in the Todorovic fight as well, but he got away with it. So this fight is really going to come down to whether or not Soriano can get an early finish here, and whether or not Maximov can make Soriano pay for his bad gas tank when he will inevitably probably slow down after 3 or 4 minutes. So that's what we're going to be mainly focusing on in this breakdown video. In terms of the tail of the tape, you can see Soriano's 29 years old, 5'11" with a 72.5-inch reach, whereas Maximov, 24 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 76-inch reach. So even though Maximov will have a little bit of a reach advantage in this fight, I don't think it's going to mean anything, just because Maximov is only 24 years old. He's primarily a grappler. He's a very, very green striker, very low-level striker. He doesn't really know how to use that reach yet in terms of his striking. So I don't think it's really going to have an impact on this matchup at all. The tail of the tape is a little bit of a nothing burger for me. What is very interesting about this fight, though, before we go into talking about how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, is that in Soriano's last fight against Brendan Allen, he suffered his first career loss. He was undefeated going into that matchup. This is very, very important because Soriano is now at a crossroads in his career where it's very obvious that Soriano's gas tank is going to be a huge issue for him in his UFC career. Everyone is going to know, based on past performances, when they fight Soriano, all you need to do is just weather that early storm. And if you can get this guy into the second and third round, your chances of beating him go up exponentially. So he's not so scary anymore because the blueprint has kind of been written on how to beat this guy. Now, I bet Brendan Allen to beat Punahele Soriano when these two guys fought because of how bad Soriano's gas tank is. And what's super important about this fight is that even though Soriano's gas tank has been an issue for him throughout his entire MMA career, it only cost him against Brendan Allen. So he gassed bad against Jamie Pickett, but he was still able to grind out a win. And he was starting to gas against Todorovic, but was able to score a knockout before Todorovic got an opportunity to make him pay the price for slowing down. What's super interesting about that is that even though Soriano's had this bad gas tank throughout his career, there was never any reason, I guess, to make a change to improve that. Because he was undefeated. It hadn't been costing him. It hadn't been holding him back. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. Why change a winning formula, right? So in Soriano's mind, he's probably thinking, this style of coming out the gate super hard aggressively and trying to get my opponent out of there early is working for me, right? I'm undefeated. I'm 8-0. I'm a UFC fighter now. I've got, 2 wins in the UFC. And you look at how many first round finishes he's got. Absolutely loads of them, right? It's been working for him. But the Brendan Allen fight was the first time that this strategy of coming out the gate super aggressive, gassing himself out, and then struggling in the second and third round, that was the first time it really cost him. So I think we're at a crossroads with Soriano now where we could really see a very different side of him against Nick Maximov. Because he's got to make that decision where, is he going to continue to fight how he has been fighting and know that if he goes into the second and third round, it's extremely unlikely he's going to win a decision? Or is he going to make changes coming into this matchup against Maximov? When you look at a guy like Punahele Soriano, he has to be a smart guy. Because he was a former NCAA Division III level collegiate wrestler. And he's also a UFC fighter, which means he's reached the highest level of 2 very competitive sports. 2 sports that is very difficult to reach the highest level of. And the only way you get good at anything in life, talent will only take you so far. The only way you get good at anything in life is by being on a journey of continual self-improvement and by being very good at learning from your mistakes. That's why I've got to where I am. Like, I'm not saying I'm any big fish, but I do make a living betting on MMA. And the way I got to that point was by making loads of mistakes over the last 15 years and learning from them and tweaking and adjusting my strategies to get to the point where I can talk to you like this in a lot of depth about these fights. And I understand these fights and I know how to make money from betting these fights. Soriano, in order to reach the level he has at collegiate wrestling and in his MMA career up until this point, he's going to be very good at learning from his mistakes, and he will have learned a harsh lesson in that loss against Brendan Allen for the very first time. So what's interesting about this matchup is, will he make changes? Will he make positive changes? Will he come in with a better gas tank this time? I think it really comes down to what is the root cause for Soriano's bad gas tank. Because a lot of the time, you get guys who gas in fights because their pacing is off. And I don't think that's the case with Soriano, right? I don't think Soriano is one of these guys that comes out, commits too much energy in round one, and just burns himself out and gasses. Even though Soriano does start fast, it is very abnormal how much he gasses out in relation to his output early in fights. He shouldn't be as tired as it has been after just 3 or 4 minutes, based on his output in the first 3 or 4 minutes of a fight. So I don't think it's Soriano's pacing that needs to be adjusted. You look at a guy like Davison Figueiredo from last week, and the impact that a change to pacing can have on a fighter's gas tank or ability to fight at a good pace for a decent amount of time. Figueiredo was a lot more measured, a lot more patient, a lot more calculated, a lot more strategic in the way he approached that fight and paced himself against Moreno and spread his output out, across 25 minutes, as opposed to headhunting and loading up on big winging power hooks to try and knock Moreno's head off his shoulders. And you saw the difference in Figueiredo's performance, what that little tweak to pacing can do for a fighter. I don't think that's the case with Soriano. He gets way too tired after 3 or 4 minutes for this to be a pacing issue, especially for a middleweight. So then, is it a strength and conditioning issue? Is his diet poor? What's the issue with this guy, or is it a genetic thing? Of course, if it was a pacing issue, that can be fixed, but I don't think it is. If it's a strength and conditioning, maybe a diet issue, that can also be fixed. But has Soriano fixed it? That's the question. The only time it would be a deal breaker is sometimes you just have guys genetically that have a bad gas tank, and Soriano could be that type of fighter. But we just don't know the answer to that question yet. So Soriano's gas tank is a huge talking point in this matchup, because round one is going to be absolute hell for Nick Maximov. He is primarily a grappler, but his offensive wrestling isn't great, and he has no striking to set up his takedowns. Maximov also has no striking defense. He can't read his opponent, and he doesn't see the shots coming. So Soriano is going to stand a great chance of getting a finish here in round one, because Nick Maximov doesn't have the striking defense to defend himself. He just doesn't. He is going to be a sitting duck to the knockout in round one. So Soriano has a great chance of knocking Maximov out in round one here. This is a real difficult fight for Maximov, particularly early on, because Maximov also is unlikely to be able to use his grappling in round one to alleviate any trouble he may find himself in striking, in terms of if he gets hurt standing in round one, if he gets caught with something big and Soriano swarms him and goes in for the finish, it's unlikely that Maximov is going to be able to change levels and use his grappling to alleviate that pressure, alleviate that trouble that Soriano is putting him in, because Soriano, with that NCAA Division 3 level collegiate wrestling, he's going to be very difficult to take down. And even though we haven't seen tons of Soriano's takedown defense, the flashes of it we have seen look pretty damn good. So I think Maximov is going to have to wait until Soriano gets very tired before he can get to his grappling. And that won't be easy because of how aggressive Soriano is on the feet and how he's very dangerous. He has major knockout power. This guy is deadly on the feet. Even deep into a fight, he still hits hard. His hand speed is slower, his volume drops, but if he catches you, he still hits very hard. So stylistically, skill for skill, it's a horrible matchup for Maximov, because Soriano is a much better striker than Maximov, and probably a much better grappler as well. But Maximov is a young, hungry bull who's tough, who is relentless, who has a great gas tank, and who is very persistent. And that's what makes this a very compelling fight. In the Jack Hermansson, Sean Strickland breakdown, we were talking about how Hermansson will likely struggle to keep Strickland on the ground for long enough to get his grappling going, because Hermansson isn't a persistent grappler. He's a single shot grappler. Maximov is a very persistent grappler, which is super interesting, because that is the exact style of grappling that will cause Punahele Soriano a problem. Because with Soriano's collegiate wrestling background, it's going to be very difficult to take him down. He's going to see the takedown entries coming from a mile away. He's going to know exactly how to deal with the threat of Maximov takedowns. However, if Maximov can grab a hold of Soriano and wear him down, Maximov can get his chain wrestling going. He can tire Soriano out. He can accelerate the rate at which Soriano gasses, and that's where the opportunity comes from Maximov to drag Soriano to the ground and use his superior cardio conditioning to kind of grind out a win. So stylistically, this is a nightmare for Maximov, and he's in a lot of trouble, and it's going to be very difficult for him to survive round one. If he can survive round one, stands a great chance of winning this. I think what is very interesting about this matchup from a betting point of view is that the odds are probably where they should be right now, because it is going to be difficult to Maximov. It's going to be difficult for Maximov to survive round one because he doesn't have the striking to defend himself. The kicker, where it gets super interesting, is maybe we isn't the appropriate thing to say, but perhaps the bookies, the people setting the odds, haven't considered that Soriano has just suffered his first career loss, largely due to an issue which is very likely to be correctable, right? If Soriano comes into this fight with a good enough gas tank to just compete at a decent level of his performance for 2 rounds as opposed to 3 or 4 minutes, Maximov is kind of screwed here. If Soriano just shows up with a good enough gas tank to fight for, 2 rounds close to his full potential, Maximov doesn't stand a fucking chance here. And that is why, from a betting point of view, Soriano is an interesting prospect here as a bet. I'll let you make your own mind up on it, because he is a big favourite, and there are a lot of big risk factors with betting Soriano. But this is a very difficult stylistic matchup for Maximov in many ways, and you'd expect a guy like Soriano to learn from his first career loss, make some big improvements, and show up looking better than ever against Maximov this weekend. And the main way he can show up looking better than ever is fixing that bloody gas tank. Will be very interesting to see if he does it. So I hope you enjoyed that breakdown. It's time for us to talk about another one. In this matchup, we're going to be breaking down the fight between Carlston Harris and Shavkat Rakhmonov, the Nomad. Another guy who is, I can't really say another guy who's undefeated, because we haven't talked about any other undefeated guys on this card. But Rakhmonov's O is there to be protected. Soriano lost his in his last fight. Will Rakhmonov lose his undefeated record this weekend against Carlston Harris? Spoiler alert, I don't think so. I think it's a very good fight for Rakhmonov. Alrighty then. Let's start off by taking a look at the odds. So, Rakhmonov, the current favourite at average odds of about 1.44, which is minus 227 for an implied probability of 69%. And if we take a look at the odds on Carlston Harris, he is currently around an average of 2.90, which is plus 190 for an implied probability of 34%. So Rakhmonov, pretty big favourite here. Harris is 34 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 76-inch reach. And Rakhmonov is 27 years old, 6'1", with a 77-inch reach. So both guys around about the same size, but Rakhmonov is quite a lot younger than Mr. Carlston Harris. And very, very interesting fight this, because Rakhmonov is one of these guys that there's a lot of hype on at the moment. He's a very hyped up fighter. A lot of people are very high on this guy. And that's interesting because there's not tons of footage available on Rakhmonov. If you look at his record, if you go back and watch, the fights that are available, a lot of his fights over sort of the last 4 or 5 years have ended pretty quickly, and we just haven't seen him really tested in too many areas. So I do understand why hype is very high on Rakhmonov at the moment, because from what we have seen, he looks very good. But I just wonder if people are maybe getting a little bit carried away with this guy. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm not too sure about this guy, but from the flashes we have seen, looks pretty decent. So, how do these guys match up from a stylistic point of view? I tell you what, let's start off by focusing on the striking, because both these guys do appear to lean more towards a base in grappling. Well, Carlston Harris is definitely primarily a grappler. A little bit more difficult to work out what Rakhmonov's base is, but a lot of his fights end up on the ground, and his grappling, from what we've seen of it, looks pretty good. So I'm assuming Rakhmonov is more of a grappler. So we'll focus on the striking. In terms of striking, Rakhmonov should have a very big advantage here over Carlston Harris. Carlston Harris is quite a sloppy, low-volume striker, and while he does carry a decent amount of power in his hands, he's just not that technical. When you look at the way Rakhmonov moves standing, he's very fluid. He's got great footwork, great head movement. He throws a very diverse range of strikes. Lots of different kicks. He switches stances, fights long. He's the total package standing. He looks very, very good. And with how big of a difference there is in technique here, if the fight does stay standing, I would expect Rakhmonov to chip away at Carlston Harris, outwork him and outclass him. Rakhmonov's striking looks significantly better than Carlston Harris's. But we know that Carlston Harris uses his striking to set up his takedowns, and he's going to want to use his wrestling to try and grind Rakhmonov out, which I don't think is going to be a very easy thing to do. Now, because there is a lack of footage available on Rakhmonov, we are going to have to make some assumptions here. But making money from betting on MMA, or making money from betting on anything really, is all about trying to make the best decision possible with the information we've got available, trying to find the fighter or the team or the athlete that gives us the better risk to reward ratio. And so even though we are going to have to make some assumptions to kind of fill in the blanks with Rakhmonov, we can make some very, very educated guesses on what we're likely to see from Rakhmonov and Harris this weekend based on, past performances. So when it comes to Rakhmonov, you would be expecting this guy to make big improvements from fight to fight. He's very young at 27 years old, and he's also been training in some of the best gyms in the world. Here you can see him training at Sanford MMA, which is one of the best MMA gyms in the world. When guys go to train at Sanford MMA, you often see them make, big improvements from fight to fight. They've got great coaches there, great training partners, and we know that iron sharpens iron. But Rakhmonov has also spent time training at Tiger Muay Thai, which is another, great gym to train at, and one of the best MMA gyms in the world. So Rakhmonov is young. He's already reasonably good everywhere. He's training at some of the best gyms in the world with some of the best coaches and training partners in the world. You would expect this guy to be making big improvements from fight to fight, and he's also already pretty good. When you compare that to Carlston Harris, this is a guy who is 34 years old now. He's going to be 35 years old in July. And, he doesn't train at any, major gyms. He just trains at like a small regional gym in Brazil without any notable, UFC fighters or high-level training partners. And at 34 years old, almost 35 years old, you would have expected Harris to have plateaued a bit. And you certainly wouldn't be expecting Harris to improve that much from what we've already seen. So when we look at the performances of both these guys, leading up until this point in their career, it looks like Shavkat Rakhmonov is going to be a difficult stylistic matchup for Harris. And then when you throw on top the fact that these guys are on opposite career trajectories, where at 34 years old you'd expect Harris to be plateauing, whereas at 27 years old you'd expect Rakhmonov to be making big improvements from fight to fight, it's easy to see why Rakhmonov is a big favourite here, and it's also easy to see why this is a very, very difficult stylistic matchup potentially for Harris. A question for us is whether or not the odds on Rakhmonov are playable. Is he still worth a bet? Or is it better to pass on this one, right? That's really what we need to weigh up. And that isn't an easy question to answer, because we've got the same problem with Carlston Harris that we had with Shavkat Rakhmonov, where there's not tons of recent footage available on Rakhmonov, as well as there's not tons of recent footage available on Harris. You can see that his last 6 fights have all ended pretty quickly. And for this reason, you've got to go all the way back to 2017, which is like, 4.5 years ago now, to get a good look at Carlston Harris in his fight against Carl Booth. What is very interesting about this is that Carlston Harris 4 years ago would have been 30 years old. He would have been in his prime. So it's very possible that Harris would have been better at 30 years old than he is now at 34 years old, because we know as fighters get older, a lot of the time they decline or at least plateau. I wouldn't expect a 34-year-old Harris to be loads better than a 30-year-old Harris. If he was in the heavier weight classes, like light heavyweight, heavyweight, I could see that being a thing, because we know that in the heavier weight classes, fighters tend to peak later on in their career. But in the the weight class like welterweight, it's a younger man's division, and so I can't imagine Harris is that much better than what we saw from him in this fight back in 2018 against Carl Booth. So a lot of my breakdown for this matchup is going to be based on how Harris looked in this fight against Carl Booth all the way back in 2017. And if he shows up and performs like he did in this matchup, I think this is a very, very, very difficult stylistic matchup for him. Because what we've seen from Shavkat Rakhmonov is flashes of really, really good grappling. I'm just going to play this in the background. What we've seen from Rakhmonov is flashes of really good grappling, good takedown defense, good scrambles, very, very heavy from top position, very technical on the ground, the way he kind of goes the wrist control and stays tight to guys to make it difficult for him to work back up to their feet. He's got very, very heavy ground and pound as well. Now, what this fight shows between Carl Booth and Carlston Harris is that Carlston Harris's offensive wrestling is very strong, very good early on. He's very physically imposing early in this fight. But in the second half of this fight, he becomes a bit of a pussycat and really lacks physicality to his grappling, which makes this one very interesting. I'm going to show you what I mean in clips here. So this is the first round of his fight against Carl Booth. And look at the physicality in which he drives in on the hips and the legs of Booth in this matchup. Take a look at the physicality here, how strong he looks in these positions, right? Drives in on his body lock takedown and just drags Booth to the ground. Loads of strength, loads of athleticism, loads of physicality. And on the ground here, you can see how strong he looks, right? He's got that tight body lock. He's staying nice and tight to Booth. He's not giving him any space on the bottom at all. He's going the wrist control on this right side to prevent Booth from being able to post and start to work his way back up to his feet. And you can see Harris looks like an absolute nightmare here. Big, strong, physically imposing grappler. He's managed to establish half guard here, and it's a very difficult position for Booth to be in. Harris is doing a really good job of staying tight and heavy from top position while also controlling this wrist on the right side, making it very, very difficult for Booth to improve his position, and he's now also advanced the mount. So early in this round, Harris looks like a goddamn nightmare. Very strong, very physically imposing, and a big problem for anyone to deal with. His offensive wrestling looks great. But if we skip through this fight, obviously I don't want this video to be super long, so we'll just kind of flick through this. If we just skip through this, you can see that eventually, after a couple minutes, Harris loses this position. It's very strange how he loses that mount position. And then look at his body language as he gets back up to his feet. Takes a big conscious deep breath in a moment, and you'll see there just like a in and out, big deep breath, and kind of showing us, even though you only have your back to him, when you watch a lot of MMA like I do, you get reads on subtle little tells like this. That body language says to me that Harris burnt himself out a little bit with that grappling exchange. And if we continue to watch this fight, what you'll see now is really sloppy, really sluggish striking, very, very slow hand speed. Harris doesn't really throw any combinations, doesn't have too much pop in his shots. He's very much a single shot striker that just loads up on one big shot and just really looks to use his striking to close the distance, to get inside, to start fishing for his next takedown attempt. But what you'll notice as this fight wears on is that Harris's physicality in these grappling positions reduces dramatically as this fight wears on. So even here in this second takedown attempt of the fight, look at how less physically imposing Harris looks in this position. He's still strong here, don't get me wrong, his technique is still good. This is still a deep body lock takedown, still doing a good job of shifting Booth's weight off this body lock with those inside and outside trips to drag him to the ground. But look at how much harder he's finding it to hold Booth down now. Look at how the physicality of Harris seems to be diminishing, and we're only, we're not even 4 minutes into this fight yet. Notice how much more comfortable Booth is here than he was in the first round. And this is only round one. This is only the second takedown attempt. Like I say, I don't want to make this breakdown super long, but we'll continue to skip through this fight, and you'll see as this fight goes, by the time we get to the second half of this matchup, Harris's offensive wrestling isn't really enough to test Booth anymore. He becomes very, very flat. Like, look here, we're right at the beginning of round 2. Look at how slow Harris's hand speed is here as he throws this right hand, and look at how laboured this takedown entry is. Look at the difference between this takedown entry at the beginning of round 2 compared to the takedown entry that we got at the beginning of round 1. Look how laboured this is. Look at how much time and space there is for Booth to dig those underhooks in play as Harris gets in on his legs. And you can just see as this fight wears on, completely different how much physically weaker Harris looks as this fight progresses. If we scroll through, here he even gets put on his back by Booth. Something as simple as an overhook. Look on the left side here how Booth just uses this overhook to roll Harris onto his back. And you can see Harris is not the same guy early in this second round that we saw in round 1. We're only a minute into this second round. Just as completely lacks physicality on his offensive wrestling now. And instead of trying to drag Booth to the ground and control him on the ground now, really he's just looking to hold Booth in this position, run the clock down and score points with some grappling control against the cage. But then if we get a look at Harris back when the fight's at kickboxing range, this is the midway point through the fight. This is midway through round 2, and just look at how sloppy and flat Harris looks. His mouth is open wide, so he's taking big deep breaths. Very slow hand speed. He's off balance when he throws. He's clunky. He's sloppy. His arms are heavy and slow, and he doesn't really pose a threat to Booth anymore when it comes to striking. He looks very, very flat here, and again, as he shoots in, very sloppy takedown entry, high up on Booth's hips, and just doesn't have the physicality to complete that takedown anymore. If we keep going, you can see it just gets worse. It just gets worse as the fight wears on. He fades and fades and fades to the point where by the second half of the fight, he's nowhere near as effective as a grappler, as he was earlier in the fight. And now we can see momentum swinging in Booth's favour. Really hoping this video doesn't get taken down for copyright infringement. Shout out to Brave. We'll like and subscribe to them for allowing us to use, hopefully allowing us to use this video in this breakdown. But yeah, you can see Harris is nowhere near as effective here. Very sloppy. And then if we go into the third round, exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Just laboured. Struggles to hold Booth down now. Booth is tired as well, do you know what I mean? Which is why Harris is having a bit of success here. But you've got to ask yourself whether a young, hungry bull from Kazakhstan that trains full-time at Stanford MMA is going to wear down as much as Booth, or if a guy like Rakhmonov is going to be able to take advantage of how tired Harris has got here, really. And you can just see just holding on in these positions, grinding on Booth, just wet blanketing him on the cage. So, let's wrap this one up as we've got this one in the background. So, this is the last time we got a really good look at Carlston Harris. All of his fights from this moment on to, Harris's most recent fights in the UFC have ended pretty quickly. We haven't seen him really tested like this and really forced to push through adversity. When you look at Rakhmonov, I think it's quite clear from what we've seen, from Harris's stand-up, that Rakhmonov has got quite a big advantage when it comes to striking. And when it comes to grappling, I just don't see this style from Harris being effective against Rakhmonov. Rakhmonov is a far more technical grappler. He's also physically imposing. He's heavy from top position. He's devastating from top position with ground and pound. I mean, even in round one, when Harris was looking very strong, very physically imposing on the ground, Booth was still able to work his way back up to his feet, was still able to hit reversals. I just think if these two guys go to the ground, even if Harris does have a little bit of success early on, I think it's only a matter of time before a young, hungry bull like Rakhmonov swings momentum in his favour and takes over and starts to grind Harris out. So, betting this fight is a little bit risky because essentially you've got to kind of make a decision on this one based on, largely one fight, because, these fights don't give us as much information to work with because they've all ended very, very quickly. Based on this fight, I think this is a very, very tough matchup for Carlston Harris. I think Rakhmonov should probably win this. Look, gambling is all about, or being profitable from gambling is all about making the best decision possible with the information we've got available. With the information we've got available, that points to a bet on Rakhmonov, but Harris could look a lot better. Maybe that was just an off night for him. Who knows? Let me know what you think in the comments below. But I do think this is a very good fight for Rakhmonov. I think it's very likely that he is a lot better than Harris, both standing up and on the ground. He's probably got a better gas tank as well. And he's on an upwards career trajectory, likely to show much bigger signs of improvement. So, hope you found that breakdown video useful. Now it's time for us to get into a fight that was only announced yesterday, I believe, between Brendan Allen and Sam Alvey. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Brendan Allen, one of the biggest favourites on the card, at average odds of about 1.25, which is minus 400 for an implied probability of 80%. And if we take a look at the odds on Sam Alvey, he is currently around an average of 4.25, which is plus 325 for an implied probability of 24%. So Brendan Allen, 26 years old, 6'2" with a 75-inch reach. Sam Alvey, 35 years old, 6'2" with a 75-inch reach. So terms of height and reach, virtually identical, but Allen is obviously a lot younger than Sam Alvey. He's going to be 9 years younger, and the younger fighter does win around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. So statistics definitely on Brendan Allen's side here. Now, obviously Brendan Allen did step up yesterday to fill in for Sam Alvey's original opponent. It was Phil Hawes, who pulled out this week. So Allen is going to be coming into this fight on about 3 or 4 days notice, and a few people have contacted me and said, what do you think this means in the context of this matchup? And to be honest with you, I don't think it means anything at all. Brendan Allen is a guy that has a very good gas tank. He's always in shape. We've seen him fight on short notice before. It's never really affected him. Actual fact, I think he might have fought Soriano on short notice. And Allen seems to be one of these guys that is always in the gym training, and cardio is one of his strongest assets, right? One of his, one of the key things that makes Allen, a very good fighter. He used his gas tank as an example to outwork Soriano, right? So, Allen's gas tank's never in question, and even if he did come into this fight against Sam Alvey not in the best shape, just on 3 days notice, we often talk about pacing, and Sam Alvey is a guy that fights at a very slow pace. He's a very low volume striker. It's not like he's going to take the fight to Allen and he's going to make Allen work very hard here. Allen's going to be able to pace himself and dictate the pace of this fight and manage his output very, very easily, because Alvey's very reactive. He's going to be looking to stay on the outside in that southpaw stance, load up on that left hand, react to whatever Allen is doing, and try to, pick Allen off as he comes forward and catch him, with a big left hand. In terms of how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, it's a very good fight for Brendan Allen. He deserves to be a big favourite because, like I've just said, at this stage in Alvey's career, he's very gun shy, he's very tentative, he's a very low volume striker, he doesn't do much. He's really just looking to load up with that big left hand and knock you out. And like Chael Sonnen once said, when you try and win a fight by knockout, you often end up losing a decision. And that's what we've seen happen to Alvey in his last, 1, 2, 3, 4 of his last 5 fights, he's lost the decision because his output is so low. It's very easy to outwork this guy. So Allen, high volume striker, he should be able to just chip away at Alvey, outwork him, outstrike him in every round, win a pretty comfortable decision here. We do know Allen likes to grapple, but Alvey, like we were saying earlier on when we broke down the Strickland versus Hermansson fight, Alvey is from Team Quest, so he's very difficult to take down, very difficult to hold down. I see this being a stand-up fight, and Allen should outwork him, should outstrike him, should win a decision. The one thing that does make this fight interesting is Brendan Allen is quite bad defensively. We have seen him rocked, dropped, wobbled, knocked out in a lot of his fights. He was knocked out in his most recent fight against Chris Curtis. We also saw Sean Strickland knock him out. Also saw Sean Strickland knock him out. So Allen's there to be hit. He is there to be dinged. Even at this stage in his career, after a significant decline, Alvey does still hit very hard. Power's the last thing to go. I could see Alvey catching Allen with a big left hand and knocking him out. But the vast majority of the time, Brendan Allen will win this fight. Because Alvey is just way too passive, way too low volume. So don't want to spend too long on that one. It's a pretty clear-cut matchup, and I would expect Alvey to struggle pretty bad in that matchup. Let's now break down the fight between Bryan Battle and Tresean Gore. So when we were talking about Carlston Harris and Shavkat Rakhmonov, we had the problem that there wasn't tons of recent footage available for us to get a really strong read on that matchup, and we've kind of got the same issue with Tresean Gore, who's only had 3 pro fights, and as you can see, he's made quick work of a lot of his recent fights, which means, again, this is a matchup where we do have to make some assumptions. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Tresean Gore is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.63, which is minus 159 for an implied probability of 61%. And if we take a look at the odds on Bryan Battle, he is currently around an average of 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So the bookies have roughly got this 60-40 in favour of Tresean Gore, who's making his UFC debut very, very early on in his career after just 3 pro fights. So, interesting matchup. Tresean Gore's 27 years old, 6 foot tall, and I believe he's got like a 72 to 73 inch reach. I learned that when I researched this fight because it came up on the tail of the tape on the Ultimate Fighter matchups. Bryan Battle is 27 years old, 6'1", with a 77 inch reach, which means Bryan Battle will have like a 4 or 5 inch reach advantage over Gore in this matchup, which is a pretty big reach advantage. But again, like with Nick Maximov, I think that Bryan Battle is going to be too green of a striker to really make it count in this one. Tresean Gore is by far the more superior striker, faster, more technical, and Bryan Battle is still very, very green, still learning, just a blue collar, gritty, tough guy that likes to wear guys down with pressure, whereas Tresean Gore is that sniper, that technician, and for that reason, I don't see the reach being too much of a factor in this matchup. So, how do these guys match up from a stylistic point of view? Obviously, it's very difficult to form super strong opinions on this one because there's not loads of footage available on Tresean Gore. But from what I have seen, Bryan Battle is likely going to be in a lot of trouble when it comes to striking in this matchup. Bryan Battle, like I said, is one of these blue collar, gritty, tough, grindy type of guys, but isn't very good defensively, doesn't really carry much power in his hands, and his strategy is to just kind of come forward and wear you down with pressure and volume. Tresean Gore has great footwork, great head movement, fast hand speed, very accurate, big power in his hands, and his striking is very, very good. From a technical point of view, there is no doubt that Gore is a far superior striker to Bryan Battle. However, Where this matchup gets interesting is that there's a huge difference in volume. So Bryan Battle throws a lot of volume, a lot of strikes. He's just not that technical with it. Whereas Tresean Gore doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes, but he's very accurate, very dangerous, very fast with what he does throw. What makes this an interesting matchup with that dynamic is that we don't really know what style is going to come out on top. Is Tresean Gore going to be able to match the volume of Battle? Has he just been a lower volume striker because he was allowed to kind of dictate the pace of fights against past opponents? So, he could choose to pick his shots and be a lot more calculated when he opened up. Against Bryan Battle, if Bryan Battle comes forward and forces Gore to engage and throws a high volume of strikes, we may see Gore able to match that volume. So perhaps Gore isn't a low volume striker after all. He just paced himself very well in past performances because those certain opponents allowed him to, whereas Battle is less likely to. Another possible dynamic that could play out on the feet here is, will Gore be able to put Bryan Battle into a defensive shell? Because in all of Bryan Battle's recent fights, we've seen him come forward, put a lot of pressure on his opponents, and he's not afraid to come forward, take a shot to give a shot, walk his opponents down zombie mode, put himself in a lot of danger to grind his opponents out and wear them down. That's what he's done in his most recent fights, but will that work against Tresean Gore? Because Gore is a much more dangerous counter striker than the guys Battle has used this strategy on recently, like Rakhmonov and Urbina. Will this strategy work against a guy like Tresean Gore? Will Battle be able to come forward and pressure Gore without getting himself knocked out or taking big damage? I don't know. When you look at how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view, when it comes to striking, you've got to lean Gore because Battle is a sitting duck to the knockout. He's bad defensively. He's going to take a lot of damage standing. This fight's really going to come down to whether or not Battle can walk through Gore's shots on the feet and wear him down with pressure and volume. And because Gore hasn't given us any reason to doubt his gas tank or doubt his ability to match Battle's pace, or at the very least be able to put Battle into a defensive shell and slow Battle's volume down a little bit and get some respect with his striking, because of those factors, you've got to lean Gore standing. In terms of grappling, Tresean Gore's pretty much a complete unknown. We haven't really seen any of his grappling in his past fights because his striking's been so good and guys have really struggled to get close enough to him to take him down. So we don't know anything about Tresean Gore's takedown offense and ground game, but what we do know is that he does train at the American Top Team affiliate gym in Atlanta that is owned by the Lima brothers, Douglas and Diego Lima, and we also know that Rowan Carneiro is a head coach at that gym. Generally speaking, guys that come out of that gym have excellent takedown defense and a pretty good ground game. Now, whether Gore also has great takedown offense and a good ground game, it's impossible to say. He is inexperienced. He has only had 3 pro fights. But generally speaking, guys that come out of that gym are difficult to take down and hold down. So take from that what you will. When it comes to Bryan Battle, in a similar way to Nick Maximov, his offensive wrestling's not good, his grappling isn't good, but he is persistent. He's got a great gas tank, he's tough as nails, he's persistent, and he is the kind of guy that will come forward with relentless pressure, and he will not quit forcing Gore to engage and work. He will not take his foot off the gas. He will be looking to drive Gore into the cage and drag him to the ground. And because we don't know anything about Gore's takedown offense and ground game, we don't really know how much success Bryan Battle may have with his grappling. That one's a complete unknown. So from a betting point of view, I understand why Gore is the favourite because he's the better striker and he comes from a gym that produces guys with notoriously good takedown offense and grappling, but because we don't know enough about his grappling, very, very risky to bet this one. So I definitely lean Gore in this fight, but because of a lack of footage, it's very, very dangerous to bet this matchup. But I do think on the feet, because Battle is very bad defensively. He's going to be in a lot of danger of being knocked out in this one. So I hope you found that useful. Now, let us talk about the final fight in this breakdown video. Thank God, because I am burning up, man. I'm all sweaty and shit. My PC pumps out so much heat that it gets very, very hot in here when I record these videos. But we are almost done. We've only got one more fight to discuss. We're going to be talking about the fight between Julian Erosa and Steven Peterson. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Julian Erosa is currently the favourite at average odds of about 1.31, which is minus 323 for an implied probability of 76%. And if we take a look at the odds on Steven Peterson, he is currently around an average of 3.55, which is plus 255 for an implied probability of 28%. So the tail of the tape is Erosa's 32 years old, 6'1" with a 74.5-inch reach. Peterson, 31 years old, 5'10" with a 70-inch reach. So nice 4-inch reach advantage there for Erosa. What's very interesting about Erosa is that I never thought I would see the day where Erosa would be a big favourite over anyone in the UFC. This is his third stint in the UFC after being released twice previously. And Erosa used to be one of these low-level guys that no one really took seriously, no one really respected that much, and was a bit of a joke, and he would always be a big underdog in his fights no matter who he was facing. Pretty sure Teruto Ishihara was a massive favourite over this guy, and so Erosa has really done a tremendous job of turning his career around, making big improvements, and he's now a difficult test for anyone in this UFC featherweight division, and certainly a very tough test for Steven Peterson this weekend, because this is a very, very tough fight for Steven Peterson. I'm very, very much looking forward to breaking this one down for you. So we look at how these two guys match up from a stylistic point of view. It is a classic striker versus grappler matchup. Julian Erosa is primarily the striker. He has a base in kickboxing. Steven Peterson is your gritty, grindy wrestle boxer who prefers to try and drive guys into the cage, drag them to the ground, and beat them up on the ground. That is the case because Peterson is quite a low-level striker, doesn't really have any power in his hands. He's not the best defensively, and will not really pose much of a threat to Julian Erosa on the ground. On the feet. When you look at Erosa, he is a predominantly kick-based style of striker, and Peterson's big weakness is his boxing. However, we have seen Erosa walk down much better strikers than Peterson, like Sean Woodson, like Charles Jourdain, and we have seen Steven Peterson really struggle when pressured by guys in the past. The Martin Bravo fight was a really good example. Even though he won that fight, it was kind of a flash KO that came out of nowhere. Bravo was doing a great job in that matchup of walking Peterson down, chipping away at him with a high pressure style of striking. We know that that is the style of striking that Erosa likes to use. He did it against Jourdain and Woodson, and it worked to great effect. And I see it working to great effect against Peterson as well. I don't think there's anything that Peterson can do to cause Erosa a problem standing. I think this is a very, very comfortable fight for Erosa if it stays standing. Erosa's weakness, throughout his career has been his takedown defense and ground game. While his takedown defense has got a lot better than it was, it's still possible to take this guy down. But what I really like about Erosa is that he is very scrambly and very active on the ground. So if a guy's got bad takedown defense, and I'm not saying Erosa has, but it's not amazing, right? Erosa's takedown defense is just kind of above average. But that's not a deal breaker for me as long as a guy knows how to work his way back up to his feet. And Erosa definitely does. In order to hold Erosa down, you've usually got to either be a really good offensive wrestler, which Peterson isn't, or you've got to get him very tired, which is not an easy thing to do because he does have a pretty good gas tank. So Erosa, with his size difference in this matchup, his above average takedown defense, his ability to scramble back up to his feet when he does get taken down, I think that's going to be enough for him to keep the majority of this fight standing, because Peterson isn't a very good offensive wrestler. He lacks physicality with his wrestling, therefore he's probably going to struggle to take Erosa to the ground and hold him down if he does get the fight to the ground. So Erosa deserves to be a big favourite in this matchup. It's a very difficult stylistic matchup for Peterson, and I think Erosa will win this fight standing up and on the ground no matter where it goes. I think Erosa is a pretty, I hate to use the expression safe bet. I'd be surprised if Erosa lost this weekend. So if you're looking for a DraftKings pick, guy to throw into a parlay, I don't see too much risk with Erosa, but obviously his odds reflect that with him being one of the biggest favourites on the card. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. I hope you found this video useful. And remember, if you want to watch breakdown videos like these ones for all the other fights on this card or the prelim matchups, go check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. Link in the description below. You'll find loads of bets on that website given by me, and they're pretty much all profitable over a very long period of time. We've got a great community. Check out the VIP chat room. You'll love the website, trust me. Community is a great place to be. And yeah, if you like this video, if you want me to keep making more of them, if you appreciate them, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know what your bets are for this weekend in the comments below. Take care, guys. I will see you all next week for a banging breakdown video for that monster card we got coming up, UFC 271. I can't wait. Love you guys. Have a great week. Hope you crush it on Saturday, make loads of money. But for now, I'm out. Take care, everyone.